welcome to Unite Now, conversations at the intersection of leadership and flourishing. We're so excited to have Dennae here with us today. As we wrap up our conversation with Dennae, please stay online with us. And if you've had any questions that you've populated in the chat or want to bring up then, we will be continuing the conversation after the interview. But welcome, Dennae. It's so good to see you. Much of our audience may or may not know who you are. Can you tell us who you are, what you do, a lot of what you do. Please kind of share the breadth of it and what you love and your family, whatever you want to share with us.
Yeah, well, it's so great to be with you guys. Yeah, I'm in Phoenix, Arizona. So I was born and raised here. My mom's side of the family immigrated from Honduras and settled out here. And so I am a longtime desert resident. And I helped my husband plant a church. He wasn't my husband at that point. That's a long story in and of itself. He was planting a church. I joined the core team and helped out with the early stages of a multi-ethnic church plant. I went to East Africa to work with church planting groups out there and some orphan care, and then came back to raise money. He asked me out. We got married, and I have been stuck in the desert ever since. So we are 15 years in, maybe 16 years into this beautiful church. That's a lot of our ministry context. And so the last 7 or 8 years as a multi-ethnic church has been a lot of learning and growth, especially in light of all the polarization and division. Really this last year and a half has been one of our most fruitful years, and just a real gift to be part of an incredibly diverse church family, socioeconomically, ethnically, culturally, as we've navigated a lot of the polarization our nation is facing. From that kind of context, I've gotten involved in a couple different things. So, Ruth, I met you originally. Our church was beginning to serve a lot of birth parents whose kids were in the foster care system as just part of one of the neighborhoods we were connected to and different relational connections. And so we launched a nonprofit called Foster Care Initiatives, really helping birth families and birth parents navigate the foster care system and do parenting classes and get partnered with church members for relational connections and support. About 8 years ago, I transitioned from that to serve a network of pastors in our city called Surge Network. And it was a group of, at the time, 30 or 40 churches that really wanted to press into being missional congregations that were present in their neighborhoods. And so I've been doing that. So I serve on the leadership team for the Surge Network, and we do a lot of pastoral formation, theological development, lay leader training, and a lot of training designed to help activate churches to love their neighbors. And then that's led to quite a bit of church planting, which has gotten me involved in 2 different national organizations. One is I'm a co-director for City to City North America. So it's 5 or 6 cities working together to grow, to help support church planting happening in our cities. And then I just, as of yesterday, actually, am officially one of the co-directors for the Creek Collective, which launched last year, a group of churches that have been African-American Latino pastors who've been ministering in predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods who want to pool resources and training to be able to plant more churches in targeted Black and brown low-income communities. So that's been another fun piece. So all those different hats I wear, a lot of overlap between each of them. But that's been the space I've been in the last decade or so.
Nice. And then, so in the midst of that, also you were working on your doctorate, and in that, I know you did a lot of research and writing on restorative leadership, right? Just curious, just how did you develop that concept? Why was it important to you to pursue that sort of line?
Yeah. So I think my entry into leadership was a difficult one. So a lot of the context I was in were either explicitly or just accidentally off limits to female leaders. And they were all male pastor networks, several of which who had very specific stances on women in leadership, and just very little imagination for how to create space where men and women can be working together in church planting or seminary training, or you name it, right? And so I was entering some contexts that were not easily accessible to women leaders. In addition, I was also, we're often in these bridge spaces. Both my husband and I were he's African American, I'm Latina, we're in evangelical church culture. And this is going back 10, 15 years, where there was beginning to be interest on multi-ethnic church and relationship. But the practice wasn't really established. And so we were in a lot of bridge spaces, and entering into dominant culture, and just realizing that even where there was aspiration and desire to be multi-ethnic, the structure, the systems, the norms, the leadership practices, what was the stories we celebrated, all of that was counterintuitive to actually establishing multi-ethnic teams. And so a lot of my early years of leadership was just kind of running into all these like brick walls, or I would describe them as like entering these furnaces, right? Where it just feels like the conditions themselves are not ones in which are healthy, or you can survive as a person from a different culture, a different background. So I think from that, just realizing, we're going to have to, if we're going to develop leaders, we're going to have to kind of rethink everything: our systems, our structures, our values, our what we celebrate, what we name as fruit, what we name as sin. And we're going to have to get really intentional about all these different things. And so as we began doing that, of course, it's easier to do that externally, and to begin to press into being prophetic or reforming, as a community on mission. But that really quickly exposes a lot of internal brokenness and trauma and pain and sin. And so just realizing so much of what's going to be required to do this work long term and have the patience and the endurance really has to come from this like really deep place of wholeness in Christ. And so a lot of the work that I've done on restorative leadership has come out of trying to articulate a vision of long-term work and reconciliation and justice that's coming from both an internal deep union and communion with God, that's expanding our ability to have deeper relationship with those around us. And then from those places, our communities are able to together be a healing presence in the midst of a lot of these furnaces or unhealthy environments, and not just name brokenness, but really work to resist it and build something different and new and countercultural to it.
Such a needed topic today, Dennae, and I really appreciate you for being here with us, talking about this. I was telling my son earlier today about the topic of this conversation, and I was asking him, what does restorative mean to you? And it was interesting. His response is it to put back together? And so my question for you is probably that, what do you mean by restorative, and what would be the opposite of that?
Yeah. So, I think, our vision of kind of the garden, before sin, before the fall, how are we made to commune and live with God and one another and creation? And then even think like new heaven, restoration, new heavens, new earth. What does this new city look like, in which there's justice and equity and human flourishing and harmony, shalom, all living interconnected. So when we think of restorative, we're thinking of God's people painting pictures or giving insight, reenacting a picture of the new heavens and new earth. What is that going to look like one day? And maybe we're not going to transform, a whole city or see something completely reordered in our lifetime. But our calling as Christians is to have these consistent daily, weekly, yearly practices that are painting these pictures, that are giving insight to the world around us, what the new heavens and new earth will look like, that restored community. restored humanity, all things being made new. And so that's a lot of times what I mean by it. I think the opposite of it, and what tends to be kind of the evangelical go-to is transformationalism, or kind of like this, a lot of times when we talk about like movement or revival, like we're talking about mass expansion of something, which is like kind of something that like, American consumerism, capitalism is great at. Like we can like figure out how to like find something that absorbs a new part of the market and grow exponentially. It's a lot of times when we talk about changing things, we're talking about like mass growth. And I think the idea of restorative is not necessarily just mass multiplication, but it's actually countercultural. It's actually challenging a dominant culture, even sometimes at the cost of numerical growth, for the sake of infecting or inserting a new culture, a new vision, new practices that completely reshape our patterns. So restorative, there's this vision of like restoring, to ultimately what only God can do when he returns and there's new heavens and new earth. But also like the practices are retraining us to relate to each other and to this world instinctually or instinctively different than the patterns of this world. And so it becomes almost like new muscles that we're building as we're kind of repairing our relational practices with self, God, and others.
You aware of what you're asking the people to do, Dennae? Are you aware that you're asking people that at the cost of the numerical growth, that they in advance they need to know that there's a price to pay? What is the response that you received with this?
Yeah, well, I think it's twofold, right? So, I do think that our leaders are exhausted and spent and burned out and depressed and experiencing dark nights of the soul and all, and even questioning their faith, right? I do think we've kind of come to the end of ourselves, at least experientially, this last year or two, where it's like this constant pursuit of growth, it's not fulfilling. We're seeing pastors all over the place be accused of abuse of power or immorality. We're losing the generations behind us are not remaining in the faith. So I think there's like kind of a sense of like, yeah, something's not right. I think the challenge is, what does it look like to embody something different? There is no quick answer, a quick fix, right? We're talking about a deepening of our spirituality, a deepening of our Christian practice. And some of the practices I write about are things like enemy love, as a leader, confessing, like confession being a natural part of our leadership practices, solidarity with the margins, peacemaking, like these things that help train us. They don't retrain us over the course of a few days or a few weeks. These are lifelong practices, prayer, deep prayer practices, that are very, very difficult to incorporate into our life and our existing patterns and schedules of like busyness and hurry. And so I do think it's a pretty big ask of saying to leaders who are really wired to run and create and start, to slow down and really spend time deeply reflecting on our internal world and our relationships, and get the help we need to be more honest and to sit longer, to discern together. So I'm seeing it emerge in different groups and communities we're a part of. And I'll say like 2, 3, 4 years in, it's amazing. Like the depth of, it feels like heaven sometimes, like the depth of relationship, still conflict, still disagreement, still sinning against each other. But there's this depth ability to work through it and confess and see reconciliation. And then I think probably because of what's happening culturally this last year and a half, there's a felt desire for it, but the, there's maybe like at the beginning of a hunger for this deeper life with God and others. But the practice of it is pretty, it's a lot of front end kind of cost. It's like Jesus telling the rich young ruler, like, leave everything and follow me. Right. And kind of everyone around being like, oh yeah, that's like, why wouldn't you do that? Right. But because of his great wealth, he walks away sad. So I do think it's a pretty high calling that we're being asked to, but like the fruit of it is it's heavenly, right? It's I think the point of the Christian life.
Hi, Dennae. I really want to say I love what you're saying, but as a pastor, it's also sort of terrifying. So what are some of the upfront costs and sort of the hardest idols to sort of kill?
Yeah. So a lot of the pastors I've worked with, I do think there's just this season of having to hold loosely, for some it's like success, right? Like our definition of success, even if we intellectually reorient and we know it's not about numbers, we know it's not about, whatever it is, even if we've like kind of gotten there intellectually, when you see a shrinking crowd, it still hits you, right? I think there's so much about how much of our like identity is embedded in our vocations. That's bigger than pastors. That's just like Americans, right? So we limit our concept of growth and achievement maybe to like the nuclear family, be a good husband, wife, raise your kids well, maybe to your job. But like beyond that, it's not necessarily oriented around this long, rich, deep life with God that actually grows through suffering and trial. And so I think there is like this detangling that has to happen of our identities and our vocations. And I think the kind of the terrifying aspect of it, we found a lot of pastors who've been able to really really make both a paradigm shift and a practice shift to really value the priesthood of all believers and really see their role shifting from being the primary minister to empowering and supporting a community of ministers. That once there's like more than just them, that's kind of holding the weight of maybe sacredness to your work. We've seen those have seemed to be able to help. Either the identity piece has been helped by that. I think a lot of leaders, maybe one of the things that's kind of terrifying is just saying the wrong thing or being, we're in such polarized times. How do you stand in solidarity with the margins and bridge completely polar opposite groups of people from a place of integrity and not just people pleasing? And so I think like even some pastors don't mind, shrinking budgets or shrinking church. It's more being misunderstood or miscategorized or saying the wrong thing. So I think it's like really knowing kind of your particular, the things that are most rewarding to you about leadership or pastoral ministry, and just finding ways for to be honest with your community about it so they can hold you accountable to that. And maybe the last one would be like power. That's another big one, is I think the fear of like letting go of power and control seems to be a big barrier as well. And so depending on kind of how you're wired, I think we have to develop really good like questions of ourselves that we're asking the Holy Spirit to examine us. We're letting our community ask us those questions. We're trying to grow in honesty about why these particular things trip us up so that we can, again, kind of learn new habits and new patterns.
Are these things, are some of these changes compatible with evangelicalism as we see it today, or do you feel like there's a sort of an evolution/revolution to come if evangelicalism is to sort of to persist?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think a lot of evangelicalism has grown out of fundamentalism, and fundamentalism has kind of re-emerged in a lot of evangelical. It's kind of like, your grandfather, maybe you have a family history of a particular disease, and it's like your great-grandfather had it, your grandfather had it, your dad just hit the age that your grandfather died of it and is like having early signs of this. You're kind of like, all right, I better change my eating habits, right? But you're kind of like thinking about your future in relation to your family history. I think we've had that sense of fundamentalism, like fighting culture wars, mischaracterizing our opponents, like just fear of a slippery slope, like our way of thinking and our way of categorizing disagreements we've inherited for a few generations, but like we're unaware. It's like we're the adopted kid who's unaware of our family history, right? And so we're kind of surprised, but when you read back, 20, 30, 50, 100 years ago, it's the same exact arguments, actually. So I do think that whatever happens to the existing evangelical church, whether it just kind of remains in dialogue with fundamentalism, or it figures out how to reimagine itself. Yeah, I don't think there is so much of evangelicalism that's tied to power and how we change things being amassing cultural and political power. And that's not compatible with definitely the vision of leadership that we've been teaching. It's all there right now. It's so enmeshed politically, right? So there's so many enemies, and you're at war with your enemies as opposed to loving and being making peace with your enemies. So there's just, I think also the hierarchy. So it's not even just like there's cultural issues. There's intellectual, kind of theological problems. There's also the structural and hierarchical challenge. So even with leaders who really have made this shift 10, 15 years ago, I'll say white leaders who like they are sold out to building a multicultural team, to being an ally, on and on and on. When it comes to changing the system and the structure that perpetuates and passes down culture, and when it comes down to it, it's the rules for how decisions are made. They don't know how to lead in that. So they might have the individual paradigm shift. They might be able to have some small community, develop friends, but to actually change an institution, they can't do. And so the institution and structures that uphold a lot of the evangelical denominations, networks, platforms are hierarchical, and the power dynamic is counter the kingdom of God. And so unless we're willing to build new structures and new systems and things that help pass down a different culture, it's going to be very, very hard for the future of the church to look more and more like Christ. I think it's looking less and less like Christ as time goes on.
When we were talking the other day, you were talking about sort of on this system structure kind of side of things, of things that we're taught even theologically that uphold this, right? Can you go deeper into what are those things for people who are like, wow, that sounds intriguing, or oh, that feels like it might resonate, but flesh that out a little bit.
I mean, I do think there's certain parts of the evangelical story that we don't have a strong sense of history on. So one example is these boogeyman, right? So it's the progressive liberal that is going, the slippery slope arguments, right? It's not to say that there is not constantly this pulling of culture that can assimilate or a Christian faith into some kind of worldly, Christless Christianity, right? It's not to say we shouldn't be concerned about these things, but we build these characters of kind of our opponents that when you look back at the history, you're like, I don't know that that was actually any different than today, where we were fighting with a boogeyman, right? We were fighting with what we were afraid our opponent would become, more so than what they were actually saying. And again, it's not to affirm what was actually being said. It's just like some of the and then I would also say there's a lot of what we've inherited, even in our church traditions today, our church divisions today, like grew in middle, upper class white realities, right? So something as simple as like the divide on women ordination, that was like a predominantly, like it was coming out of the feminist movement. It was happening in, alongside, it was a parallel movement to the civil rights movement. And it's not to say there wasn't overlap, but there was like a whole nother movement of civil rights and conversation happening on justice related to the margins, to African Americans, to migrant workers. And there was all kinds of churches developing theology and practice out of that. Meanwhile, kind of middle class, upper middle class, white, suburban, churches, seminaries are having this divide on complementarian versus egalitarian, and it was very culturally siloed. That's not to say that those things don't matter today, but it's like so many of the wars grew out of very segregated, ethnically and class conversations that were not actually culturally relevant back then to different people groups. And yet somehow now, 30 years later, they've made it across the board into all different cultures, but we forgot some of the origin sources of where these came from. And so I just think there's a lot, evangelicalism has always had a lot, at least the last 50 years, related to like, kind of, we were like a step up from fundamentalism. And maybe I'm very much oversimplifying things, but it was like fundamentalism had gotten out of hand. This was kind of like the reform movement to that. But what did fundamentalism grow out of? And there were some legitimate fears and concerns and challenges, but there were some legitimate posture problems as well. And just improving from one generation to the next and starting something new isn't enough if we're not also repenting of these besetting sins and saying, here's the behaviors we're not going to bring in to the new thing we're starting. Here's the postures we're not going to continue. And because we didn't do that, we've had countless divisions, and it could happen again right now, right? We could have another divide right now without either quote unquote side repenting of postures and practices and how we demonize each other and how we talk about one another and all kinds of scripture we violate in terms of our brotherly love and affection and practice, and just, kind of give this to our kids and grandkids, kind of that same divisive spirit.
It's just, I'm just thinking, what about, as I'm hearing you, I am drinking the Kool-Aid, right? And I've been drinking the Kool-Aid since before I met you, which is 5 minutes ago. And I pastor a small church, multicultural church, and I've had people in higher places of leadership telling me that my ministry may not grow at a large number, in large quantities, because the model of our ministry, and because I'm more of a shepherd than a corporate leader, right? Type of thing. And I'm thinking of those people that they may think that they're in too deep already, right? Those people that say, I have buildings to pay for. I've seen pastors that get hired in these big churches that the moment they began speaking about loving your neighbor, whoever that person is, all people, that people getting fired from these denominations. And those who say, I believe you, I get this, but I have no choice but to play the game.
Well, I think, a couple things. Yeah, that's a lot of our conversation. Whether people are explicit on that, or they just kind of in the back of their subconscious mind, that's their operating system, right? Like, like when your computer is overloaded and it's like running really slow and you haven't like updated or installed the last update. I think that I encounter that a lot, where it's like, there's some things going on in the background of this way of thinking and of leadership style that's not being named, but it's why we're seeing so many things get stuck. And I think that's I think that's often the narrative. I have to, I've heard pastors say, I have staff I'm responsible for, to pay the salaries of. And yeah, I mean, having staff now, I really appreciate the weight of that on the leader. I shepherd these people. I don't want to, be divisive for the sake of being divisive. Like, I love these people, that how do you just throw them out, whatnot. So I guess a couple things I would say is, one, some of it in and of itself reveals a lot about us. So for example, most churches, not all, but most of those churches who would say that would be willing to lose half their church if they were forced to change their position on same-sex marriage, right? They would be like, tomorrow, they'd lose half their church. It would be painful, it would be hard, it would be sad, but they wouldn't make that concession. Or many churches I work with, if it was like female pastors or female preaching, right? Like, very different issues, but like just, or if it was paedo baptism or speaking in tongues, right? They're willing to lose a significant amount of people on a topic that's very important to them. So when pastors say that on race and poverty, I always want to kind of frame that in, you're willing to do this on sexuality, but not on racism. Why? And a lot of times they don't know. They've inherited a history, both in America as well as, actually in the church, that they don't know about. So there's that aspect of it. The second thing is just like the way we, when people say your church isn't going to grow. I mean, that again, it's a huge paradigm shift. There's this blindness that has been developed from American corporate, marketplace realities, right? So it's like, yeah, that doesn't really square up with like Jesus and the 99 and leaving them for the one. Like, that's not quite the church growth model that we had in mind. Jesus spent, so even like our definition of growth, and it's not to say that growth is unimportant, right? So like we want to see maturing disciples and healthy communities. And over time, there is usually incremental growth. But this idea of like, you're not, of being capped in number, or number being what makes you influential, it's everywhere. It's just everywhere within evangelicalism. And it's a lie from the pit of hell. And it's wholesale adoption of American culture and applying it to Christian practices. And we've got to both name it and resist it, and then have different ways of talking. So sometimes I'll say to, megachurch pastors, would you do anything different if you knew right now the 10,000 people sitting in your church, none of their kids would end up in the faith in a generation? That if your church could only grow by the children and the next generation that you guys are forming right now, and you knew that your church would be 10% of what it is right now, would you continue the same way? We're measuring based on who's in our seats today, not in the kind of disciples we're making 20, 30, 40 years out. And we're living the consequences of that right now. So, I would say, like, to those pastors, I would say, find your tribe, find like-minded people. Don't be in spaces that, or limit spaces that's the norm and that's the culture, that they're celebrating things that aren't, but, the metrics need to line up with the kingdom of God. And be honest about what we do want to, so name the kind of fruits we do want to see. We want to see reconciliation. We want to see conversion. We want to see restored marriages. We want to see teens, without parents, welcomed and loved and brought into families. Just name the kinds of things you want to see. But we've got to stop trying to reform this dominant culture and begin to create new culture.
I've been saying this for a while. I don't know where I got it. Maybe I made it up, but I really feel like it's hard to proclaim a new kingdom with an old economy, that we need a new economy. And something that you mentioned, like, hey, I can work at Starbucks if I have to, right? That that courage to say, I don't need this paycheck, right? I want to see the kingdom come. But what other sort of systemic changes in the way we think financially, economically, asset-wise, do you feel like the church can really make some shifts economically that says this new kingdom comes with a new economy?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, teams are really important. So the lead or head senior pastor model, you know, I'm not saying everyone has to do co-leadership or shared leadership, or that everyone's even wired to do it well. I've seen it blow up in terrible ways. But I do think there are practices to leaders leading a healthy team, and that team leading the church. That's really important. And it really does create space for bivocational work and other things. But again, those require developing some skills and habits that are pretty mundane and boring and hard. And if leaders, could figure out how to do that, where they could operate within a team, I think you see a lot of change, even economically. I would say even that too, like building a team around a mission as opposed to around a leader. Most churches or leaders I consult with, they're building a team around themselves as opposed to the team being built around the mission. And that's a very different makeup, right? Of who you hire and why and how you view each other and treat one another. I think our relationship to power and platform and celebrity culture has to be dealt with. And I think it has to get dealt with in like our theological formation and training. We need to go a lot deeper into into both the global church and leadership practices that they're developing in the midst of persecution and suffering and micro church economies, as well as the historic church. And I think that's going to be that's just a very most of our pastors and leaders are reading, whatever's coming off the press and kind of the trendy, most helpful books. And I think if we can really do the deeper work together of what does leadership look like in the midst of suffering and small and quiet, that's going to be important. I think some kind of mix of like Eugene Peterson and John Perkins, like what does like activism look like from a place of rest, and change, how do we change culture? But I think those would be some of the economy pieces. Buildings, how we think through space. One of the things I just was in a conversation yesterday with a pastor about a Hispanic church in his existing church. And again, how people think through ownership and who the church building belongs to and stewardship. It's very American. It doesn't reflect, what you see happening in the epistles or the gospels or Acts or the epistles. And so how we think through like this massive money we spend on a building, if that is useful, then how is it being stewarded for the life of the community? How is it being shared with other church plants? All those things I think have to be rethought.
You've talked about a little bit some of the practices that we need to look towards, but so it's like, hey, I want to be a restorative leader. I want to be that kind of person. How do you develop that way? How would you say that a person would start to move away from maybe where they are now towards being a more restorative leader?
So one of the things we've talked a lot about here locally this last few years, probably since 2016, I think we hit a lot of burnout. We had a lot of growth in, justice, reconciliation, multi-ethnicity. I think 2016 was really resurfaced a lot, and 2020 surfaced a lot more. And we were seeing burnout, and just a difference in terms of like those of us whose faith was formed in the margins were like, oh, this work is life-giving. Like this, like we exist to do this stuff, right? And those who were joining, who really had a lot of privilege and were joining because they had a conversion of, like they had an awakening and a conversion of story, and they were able to see what was going on, but they joined from that place of privilege. I think hit really big burnouts in relation to not being able to change things either as fast as they wanted or at all. And there was like this real like spiritual depression almost that we began to see happen among a lot of those pastors. So just this idea of like prayer, like where I've started calling it anchoring prayer. But the kind of prayer practices, both solitude, times of like prolonged times of meditation and silence, and there's all kinds of historic practices around like self-examine and confession. So like just developing those capacities in prayer, and then kingdom prayer, right? So we began to do a lot of reflection on, especially those of us who are more prophetically oriented, like we're naming the brokenness and the sin and we're grieving and lamenting it. But we need to actually develop the capacity to pray, to envision what the world, what are we missing out on, right? So it's not just like that racism is this horrible evil that's harming our brothers and sisters, but what is like the loss of not repenting from that sin? What's on the other side of repentance and reconciliation? What would our relationship look like with each other if we were willing to turn from these sins? And learning how to like pray about the kingdom to come in ways that really foster hope and long suffering and patience. So I mean, that might be like the Christian-y answer, but like just developing a much richer prayer life and spirituality is really important. And then from that, I think communal practices of confession. So I think lament is a newer topic that different leaders the last 4 or 5 years have been writing on more prolifically. And I think I'm glad that we're talking about that, and we just need to do it together. We need to learn how to confess both our individual sins, but also corporate and communal. So we've both in our kind of worship services and just training with pastors are more and more just giving models of what does it look like to repent for generational sin, or as a community for not representing God's character. Like, how do we actually do that together? So those would be some things. I guess another one that we've talked a lot about, we've done, again, a lot of practice around is solidarity with the margins. We can say that, but how does that actually get fleshed out day to day? And so if we're wanting to form restorative leaders, we've got to put people in environments where they can learn how to live in solidarity and struggle through it. And there's these different kind of layers to their growth in that. And so that's really important. We can't just teach on it. We actually have to be in environments where we're learning those things. And then maybe one last one that we've talked a lot about and I've written a lot on is just enemy love. That, political opponents are not all enemies, right? So I do think we're kind of in some ways beginning to use that category for just like really silly disagreements. But there are actual there's, especially those who are suffering from injustice and oppression have actual enemies, and there's political and individual and cultural things that are hostile toward them. And so what does it look like to really move toward love and practices of peace in those situations? And so those are skills. Those are like, not skills, but to practice enemy love requires you can't will yourself to love your enemy, right? You can't just be, okay, God told me to love my enemy, therefore I'm going to do it. Like, it is a deeply internal spiritual process, and takes time. And then you learn new habits to behave lovingly towards enemies. But that internal, external type of practice is very formative to maturing a Christian leader.
Dennae, I would like to also ask you on the flip side of that question on how you develop the restorative leader. Every coin has two sides, right? So I'm thinking now on the community, on our context, right? So the question is now, how do you develop the community? There is a segment in the community out there And for these leaders that they maybe are getting it and they really want to do follow this conviction, this newfound conviction, but some people are just looking for the consumerism mentality. They're just basically saying, preach to me, make me laugh, sing to me, make me cry, and take care of my kids, make me rest at least for an hour. I don't care about the rest.
Yeah. So my husband this last week was saying there's kind of 3 different things that we could be as a church. You know, we can be a place that people can come on for being sent out and equipped. So they come, they're poured into, they're pouring into one another so they can be sent out. Kind of like like a boot camp almost, or a training ground. The second is we can be a hospital. You're sick, you're not well, come, you're cared for and healed to then be sent out. And the third is a cruise ship. And it's like, we can be the first 2. We can't be a cruise ship, right? So yes, there is a dominant part of Christianity that wants consumer culture. They want to consume a spiritual experience. And we have to ask ourselves, is adapting to that ungodly, like that idol, the American idolatry of consumerism, ultimately what's best for those people that we're called to minister to? It doesn't mean that they don't need places of rest and healing, right? The hospital. It doesn't mean that part of being equipped doesn't mean you need an hour from your kid. You know, your kids need to be also equipped in a place that's contextual for them, and you need some space just to kind of zone in as an adult. It doesn't mean that you can't have those things, but those are different. You're giving those things for different purposes than just consumption. And so, yeah, I mean, pragmatically, I think our pastors who are more pragmatic, they're not going to agree with my answer. It's just like, I just don't think that's not what we're called to be as a church. And there's plenty of churches in your city who can kind of, that person can go sit at and get the experience. Praise God, right? When people leave our church because they want a more conservative, fundamentalistic church, I have no doubt they'll find another church who can give them that. Who's not gonna find another church are the people with questions, you know, on the other side of it, right? And just like we wouldn't run a strip club because people in our church have sex addictions, we can't run our systems and structures to appease consumerism and individualism and reinforce an idea that we're called to be a nuclear, you know, just our tiny individual family. You know, we're called, God's people are called to something different. So I know that's not a good practical answer, but I've seen large churches find ways to become missional and to take people along. And it doesn't mean the quality of their childcare diminishes, but the questions they're asking about the kinds of disciples they're making completely changes. And that's a really important shift we have to make.
Well, thank you. Thanks for taking some time with us. Thank you for the work that you do in many different contexts in serving the church and investing in the church and in pastors and leaders, and in your own local family and community. I treasure my friendship with you, and I'm just thankful that you are willing to share with us and our community here.